Hi, this is Machiavelli, and I'm older than the esports historian here on Thorin's YouTube channel.
Right, this is going to be another episode of Reflections, and my guest for this one is DaHanG, who is now retired, but return guest, actually. We did one of these in the past. Actually, the timing of when we did it was quite interesting too, because basically I did it, like, sort of the first year that Quake Champions came around, if people remember, like, right at the end. And obviously at the time, interestingly enough, you'd also just come out of that period where you were potentially going to do Overwatch, if people remember. You did that for a while with Team Liquid. So I actually thought what would be cool is, because now officially you're retired, we can do the true reflection, where now you don't have to worry about what people think or what the rivals all think. So the first thing I would ask is just that, let's skip to the end immediately. Like, why retire? Why is this the right time to step away and put things away? And are you fully done now? Or do you ever in your back of your mind have a thing of sort of if there was a Quake 4, you might come back or something?
I mean, 99% sure I'm done. The last couple years of Quake Champions, it just seemed like it was... I mean, I love Quake, no apologies, and I think Quake Champions is a great game, and I think as they patched it up and improved things over time, it really was a really good game. I think it could have been better at launch, but nevertheless, it just ended up being more and more difficult to manage kind of the career, like the real-life career, and also compete against folks like Razy and Rapha and Kilson and all them, who it's just, I'm already a little behind them, and they still seem hungrier than me, and
Right.
The Quake Champion scene in terms of the big prize purse tournaments were starting to get a little less and less, so it was like a decoupling of all those things where I said, I don't want to just stick around to be kind of mid-tier in the pro scene. I think it's time to kind of step away, and so there's a lot of factors, but I've been playing for a very, very, very long time, so I don't think anyone could say I retired too soon either, so.
One thing I thought was cool, actually, is if we go all the way back to the beginning of your, like, esports / competitive career, you obviously were playing Quake 2, if people don't know, right? It's not like you were playing Quake 2 in 1999, though, or 1988.
No.
In theory, the question I would have to you is this, actually. That implies when you first began, it really wasn't about esports, right? It wasn't about, like, money or fame. It was just about playing the game, right?
It was. So what happened was, I just happened to get a Quake 2 CD from a friend in the neighborhood. This might have been around 2000. Obviously I don't know anything about esports, and esports wasn't really much in 2000 anyway. There wasn't much to talk about. So we were playing on 56K, free for all, and you got to remember, like, growing up, at least, for me in the 90s, when you played video games, you were playing with your friend on a controller in front of a TV.
Sure.
So the thought, I don't think people really, everyone takes
the novelty's
it for
crazy,
granted right
isn't it?
now. Yeah, the people take it for granted right now, but it was mind-blowing that you could play with your friend on the internet, even though it was a horrible experience on 56K modems. It was like probably the most raw fun I've had just from a video game, just like the 2000, 2001, playing with friends on free-for-all servers in Quake 2. So that's basically, it was almost just coincidence, like, friend gives me the CD, the Quake 2 CD, I pop it in, and I kind of just fell in love with the game. But it was more just falling in love with Quake than, trying to be the best and hearing about these tournaments and really trying to compete. I just kind of just stuck with Quake 2, and then some of the people in the Quake 2 servers would say, hey, why aren't you playing Quake 3? I'd be like, well, I love Quake 2, and I don't even know if my PC could run Quake 3. Remember, I'm like 12, 13 years old.
Right.
I don't really have everything figured out. I'm just playing games, right? So I just stuck with that for quite a few years until I started really improving naturally and, started just falling into the scene later. But there was never any kind of grand vision or anything like that to be a pro or anything.
One thing I'd like to ask is, because another thing we can do to sort of set the context of how different gaming was back then, is I often think in the early esports games, it's funny that no one now would get this, but there wasn't even an idea that I as a player could ever complain to the game dev and they'd change the game based on what that idea, look, we all complained, but that idea didn't even exist, we were just some guys on the server. So here's the question I'd have for you. What was the appeal of Quake to you? Because I will say in the early days, a lot of what people don't like about Quake, that it's so hardcore and extreme. I always thought that's one of the things I loved about it. It's the fact that like the joke is, yeah, I used to get railed a million times in Quake 2 as well, but that made me want to be like, I want to be the one with this OP weapon. You know, like I could sort of always get into it. So what did you like about Quake 2? What was so appealing to you?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, you could find so many ways to improve. I mean, remember when you just start, you're not even moving left or right with the straight keys.
Exactly.
And like just within like a couple weeks, you can start seeing like, hey, I'm kind of bunny hopping, I'm gaining some speed, I'm jumping up the stairs, I'm double jumping. Even if it's sloppy, you can start selling, or you can start being able to see that you're improving. And I know you improve in all games, but there's something about like, it was so definitive that you're just moving more gracefully, the movement system of it, because Quake 2's movement was like, the double jumping was very unique, and it was actually more sophisticated than like Quake 3 and QuakeLive's movement.
Yep.
And you know, you could just run in a server, you could try to like, it's the infamous Quake 2 DM1 the edge mega health jump. I could just practice those jumps, and you could jump to the little window on a ledge, then to the mega health, which was the easy way, and that takes a long time to figure that out. And then you do the harder ways to get to the mega health. It's just, there's so much gratification for whatever reason.
When you first land that one you're talking about, the really hard one when you go up and backwards. Yeah, that is like fucking, you feel like you're Neo in the Matrix, don't you, and land that.
Yeah. I would see people do these jumps, and I'd just be like, oh my God, I have to learn how to do that. Right. You know, like it was just, the movement was, because the weapons, I mean, everyone loves rocket launchers and rails, but for me, it was the movement that just, because it's almost like dribbling in basketball. If you can't do that, you can't do the other things, right? So you got to be able to do that first. Everything else should follow. So the movement, that's how I basically fell in love with Quake 2.
Because, I mean, look, maybe later we'll talk, obviously, at the end about Quake Champions, which is obviously quite a different departure in the Quake series. But I will say, I do think when people, because it's actually a historic thing that a lot of people who are Quake players, whatever version they're in, or in the latest version, they're just Quake players. Like they don't really think of themselves like, I'm a general gamer. And they're not like those guys back in the day, like, I'm just a pro and I'll go to whatever game. Like, everyone knows the whole thing about Quake people is, it's kind of like what you're describing. It's the feel. Once you get that feel, you don't want a different engine. You don't want to play Unreal Tournament or something, right? Was it hard for you to go and play games that weren't Quake?
A little bit, but at that point it was all about competing. So it was all about my personal preference of like a movement system and all that. It's kind of thrown out the window, and it's all about like, this is the new exciting thing to do. So that's what's motivating me. And you know, then because I'm thinking specifically about Overwatch, and like, so it's like, it's a big team thing. There's a big commitment with practice schedules and all that. So it was almost a little bit of a new world, but the drive to actually compete, and like, you know, you're thinking, oh, there's a tournament coming up. Let's see what we can do to be at our best for this, you know, upcoming tournament. That kind of took precedent over any kind of, you know, personal, you know, gameplay preferences, you know.
Do you remember either in Quake 2 or maybe when like you heard about the esports side of games like Quake 3, QuakeLive, do you remember who the first famous players you heard of or first demos you saw? Do you remember anyone that stood out?
Honestly, it was probably Puri from Quake 2.
Sure.
I didn't really hear about, because I can't pinpoint the exact moment of time someone told me about Thresh or Machiavelli or Fatality. I can't really pinpoint that. There's no like real memory of that, but like in the Quake 2 servers, because there was a time when they were going to do this retro tournament, and it was retro in 2005. That's how long ago this was. It was a retro QuakeCon tournament for Quake 2, and everyone's like, oh my gosh, Puri's going to just destroy this thing. So really, he was like, and it might have been 2003, 2004 when I started hearing about these like amazing European duelers in Quake 2. But Puri's the name that just always kind of stuck out for whatever reason, just primarily because of my Quake 2 background.
Sure. By the way, are you someone where, is there like an alternate timeline where you don't choose to go to a different version of Quake? Like, there's people, if people don't know, there's people who to this day play Quake World and Quake 2 and obviously there's even people like QuakeLive, believe it or not. So is there a world where you could have just stayed like the hobbyist nerd and not gone the pro side, as it were?
Meaning like dive right into like Quake 3 and start competing as quickly as possible?
No, I mean the other way around. Like, is there a world where you just chose not to move on to other games? You just said, actually, Quake 2 is just my shit. I'm just going to keep playing this, or I just stay casual. I don't try to go competitive or something. Were you always going to be drawn to the esports side, do you think?
I think I was, because it's the exciting part back when I'm thinking, again, kind of in that 2004, 2005 era where I was starting to really improve in Quake 2. everyone in the servers is talking about Quake 4 coming out,
right?
And all this, so like that's like the new thing, and I'm like, oh, well, that is interesting because, again, a lot of kind of Quake 2 elitism where we didn't like Quake 3 that much,
no one did.
So
yeah.
So we're waiting for Quake 4, and probably everyone has their own favorite Quake, like you're alluding to, but I think because all the friends that I kind of made in these team deathmatch and duel servers were just chatting it up so much, I think it was inevitable that I was going to kind of dive right in as well.
Right. By the way, the thing you referenced there is also another thing that is totally forgotten to history. Mate, I remember the days when Quake 3 was the first big esport game of Quake that I united it. And I can tell you everyone in it hated it because they all came from Quake World, Quake 1 or Quake 2. And everyone from those games were like, this is just watered down version of my game. So the funny thing is, even though people also hated on Quake 4 in a similar way, I imagine it must have had an obvious appeal because to me, Quake 4 is an obvious spiritual successor to Quake 2. I mean, you look at the movement, it's got more Quake 2 in it than Quake 3. Right?
I think it's a little bit of both. I think Quake 4, when it comes to the movement, because of the crouch sliding, which here's what someone could fact check me on this, but Quake 2, the double jumping, my understanding is that was basically a bug.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
When it first came out, you couldn't double jump. I'm talking 1997.
Right.
Then a patch came out. It was unintentional. You could double jump. Similar to Quake 4, the whole crouch sliding thing, that wasn't really intentional as far as my understanding.
Right, I see.
And when people started learning it, they would just glide a little bit on the ground, just slide a little bit. Then you could do it around the corners, and then they could optimize the length at which they do it. So the crouch sliding element of that really makes it. It's hard to say. I actually think it's probably a little more like Quake 3 just because of the weapons. Because the weapons are so hard hitting. Okay. They're not as, there's no shot delay with Quake 2, infamous netcode. But it's very unique. It's when people think Quake 4, I think they think Quake 4. They don't think this is very similar to a previous Quake,
I actually think the funny thing as well, if people don't remember, is when all these Quake games come out, especially up until QuakeLive, because they always start everyone's super casual, no one knows any of these bugs, etc. They always actually start as, this is why the early demos are impossible to watch. They're always just people walking around like a really old school bat.
Bumping into walls even.
Yeah, but you always see, like you're saying, that was what made Quake 4 playable, was when people mastered the crouch slide, the game became so much faster. But that's also what I was thinking about with the Quake 2 example. Old Quake 2, when people walked, was rubbish. Once people could move really quick, it was awesome. That unlocked the game. That, back in the day, if you actually had to walk, Q2DM1's enormous. If you can run and slide around and double jump, it's mega quick how fast you can get around and dominate the guy. It's kind of actually essential to Quake is the movement, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that it makes the entire game what it is, and you feel like Superman when you're able to do all these jumps. I just stuck into my mind, there's a jump on Quake 2 DM1 where you jump from the upper rocket launcher to the extra rocket ammo by the railgun area. I remember just for hours practicing that. I would fall short. And then I finally made it one time, and just so gratifying, And then once you got it, you're kind of like Superman just flying through and making those old, 1998 demos look like a joke in comparison, So.
When they came to the era when Quake 4 was this pro game, and obviously it had that year with WSVG and all those tournaments in America as well, and so basically you could be almost anywhere in the major Western world and you could be part of this pro scene. What I want to ask you was this, is if someone looks up now on an esports earnings site, they're going to think, oh, this amount of money is nothing. But I don't think they realise, because it was a 1v1 game, it was actually pretty decent money, actually. And in fact, it was kind of at the time, considering the dev wasn't involved, it's kind of the last hurrah of the open circuit, embracing Quake before things later on IEMs and, the game dev themselves put money up. So I actually always thought the other way around, DaHanG. I always thought people involved in this scene actually hoped this was the start of something bigger, right? And there'd be a scene like this for 10 years. Did you have a similar sense? 'Cause I remember the actual media surrounding it. It seemed like people were pretty hyped for the game. It's just it only had a couple of years and it died off, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. I mean, and what's funny is I was kind of on the sidelines because I didn't really love duel too much, and that was obviously the main game type. And then the next year they announced another circuit, like WSVG in 2007. And what's interesting is they actually made it go from, instead of just the top 3 get a payout, 4th place get 0, they went all the way to top 8. And I was like,
right.
I think, because again, I didn't really compete until basically that year. And I was like, I could get top 8, and then I started competing. And you get all the money, you don't split it. And keep in mind, if you're 18 years old, 19 years old in 2007, where you're taking away almost 20 years of inflation, getting like $5,000 or whatever
that's
is
legit,
a big deal. Yeah, that's not. And so, and then the fact that they would have an event. So you could, if you're a top 5-ish player, you can walk away with 10 to 20 grand, and it's all for you. You don't split it amongst teammates. And so, yeah, I mean, we were all optimistic that this would, I don't know about Quake 4 specifically, but I know that everyone was like, Quake is here to stay.
Yes.
We love this game. We want to see more of these tournaments, because there were actually a lot of really, really, really good players. There were some like really good players that just kind of came and went. Like I'm thinking of like Fuki and like Zamus and a lot of Swedish players that kind of popped in. They were great. They got maybe a second place, and then they kind of just went off and did their own thing. But there's just competition from everywhere, so it was a very exciting time, and we definitely were hardcore, ready to keep playing year after year after year at that point.
It'll probably surprise modern day fans to hear that DaHanG once upon a time wasn't just a duelist. Like you weren't the guy who woke up every day and then played X amount of duels, right? It wasn't naturally the format that appealed to you. When did the transition change? Because obviously now, like you've done it for the last 20 years, 15 years at this point in time, all right?
Yeah, I mean, even in Quake 2, I just loved Team Deathmatch, and then I played. Once Quake 4 came out, I played the TDM in there and Capture the Flag. It's always appealed to me. It's just more. I don't know if dynamics necessarily the right word, but there are more variables. If there's with duel, I feel like it's way more kind of muscle memory. With team-based Quake, it's way more reactions, especially to communications and where your team is, and even kind of sacrificing yourself on purpose for trying to get a quad damage or whatever the case may be. I mean, it's just personal preference and personal taste. There's no right or wrong, but it's just that's always appealed to me more than duel. Duel's been tougher for me because there's a super kind of finesse to duel that people don't realize, like placing the absolute perfect rocket while backpedaling and things like that a lot of people don't realize, which doesn't really apply to a lot of the team games. Of course it does to some extent, but in the team setting, it's more about like being there for your teammate and coming and going at the right times and capitalizing on 2 versus 1s and timing items with your team, rather than just like the optimal, almost like basketball level finesse where you just hit the dream shot while dodging. That element has been probably the most difficult part of my game to master, the way someone like rapha or Cypher have basically been able to master those elements.
The funny thing about how the esports framing of a game affects how people think of the game is people do just think of Quake as a 1v1 game, like as though that's the default format. But the funny thing is, obviously, Team Deathmatch existed the entire time. It just never was heavily the esports side, because unfortunately, games like Counter-Strike sort of took the place of obviously, instead of having a Team Deathmatch team, you'd have a Counter-Strike team, wouldn't you? And it's only one extra player. But I've actually always wondered, DaHanG, I know a lot of players, a lot of actually very great European TDM players used to tell me this. They used to tell me, I wish I lived in the world where there was no Counter-Strike and it was just Team Deathmatch was the game. and a lot of them, by the way, the real haters just say, fuck duel as well. It was just for all nerds, wasn't it? Like they always wished, because people who are just general fans of esports might not know how in-depth Team Deathmatch can be. Like it could have been a whole sport on its own, right? Would you have preferred a world where you were a team player as opposed to a 1v1 player if you had the choice?
I would, absolutely. Because to me, duel, depending, of course, on my mood, it almost feels like a chore. Like you have to go through the motions, you have to do all this, and the thing that kind of sucks about it is, if your rail is off against a good opponent, you just lose a lot of the time. Whereas in a team game, especially when it's a larger time limit too, because the team format in Quake for team games is typically 20 minutes, so there's just so many more variables, so many more than just what's your rail percentage at the end of the day, or so I definitely would prefer, or I would have preferred an alternate reality where that was the big esports format, some sort of Quake team game, whether it was TDM or CTF.
Do you have a preference between the two? Seems like in America, people tended more towards the CTF side, maybe?
They did, yeah. So I started in TDM and Quake 2, and then I got into CTF with QuakeLive. I think QuakeLive is also more exciting to spectate because there's a clear objective. TDM, once you're up by 20, 30 frags, I mean, it's kind of like a basketball game in a blowout. Once you're up by 30, 6 minutes left in the fourth quarter, barring an absolute miracle, you get bored watching it. CTF, you can be down 1-0, and it could seem like you're dominating, but one lucky rocket, one good quad run, whatever it is, the game's more exciting. So I think CTF, I think it's more intense as well. I think CTF, there's an intensity to it and an urgency to it just when I'm playing it where we have to go here, teammate, meet me at mid, blah, 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 like there's more hype and urgency to a lot of those situations. TDM is like, I love it, but it's more going through the motions, I feel like. And I know it's hard to be very, very specific as to why I'm making that distinction, but that's kind of just the way I feel about it.
Right, being as before QuakeLive came, there was like that 1 year when all the tournaments disappeared from Quake 4, where we just played Quake 3, and then they brought out QuakeLive, which was sort of like Quake 3 anyway, and then everyone just transitioned to that, and pretty much the whole scene just went over like this, right? Was there ever a time when that game came out where you ever wondered, like, well, shit, everyone else has been playing that Quake 3 game for 10 years. I was playing fucking Quake 2. Did you ever feel like you were disadvantaged?
I did, because especially, so what's funny is when that Quake 4 time kind of expired and we went to Quake 3, a lot of folks were like, why aren't you playing? And I'm like, I never really played Quake 3, and it's the same 5 maps from 10 years ago, and there's not a lot of prize money. It's just not that exciting to me, And then QuakeLive came out. The reason why I got into QuakeLive, really, I mean, obviously I love Quake. I was going to get into it. It's just a matter of how seriously I would take it from a competitive perspective. But they announced pretty early a big CTF tournament at QuakeCon, and I was like, I want to kind of try this. But they also had 2 new duel maps that I really loved, too. They had Furious Heights and House of Decay, which would be Tourney 7 and Tourney 9. And that means when I go right into this new game, and yes, it's basically Quake 3, but there's subtle differences. But I was able to hold my own against like the top players on Furious Heights and House of Decay,
I see.
kind of right out of the gates because people hadn't played those maps for 10 years. So I was already kind of like interested in it from that perspective as well. So, but I could definitely feel like on DM6 and ZTN, some of the classic maps, I felt disadvantaged. At least initially. I mean, you got to. There's a buffer of time where you can't use that excuse anymore, because once you've played enough times, the disadvantage kind of runs its course, and it's may the best man win. But definitely the first, 6 months or whatever it was, I definitely was not nearly as good on those old maps as some of the others.
By the way, that's one thing I'll even just say, actually. Normally, I'm a bit of a hater about like more modern games and they're all watered down. I've got to give props in QuakeLive, actually. Bearing in mind, Tourney 7 wasn't an original Quake 3 map. It is a fucking brilliant map. Like, it's got to be one of the better FPS maps ever made, right?
I love it, yeah. You can play it fast, slow, in between, and it's so balanced with the mega health is up high in a room where it's very vulnerable, and it creates these tricky spots. Do I really want to jump for it or get LG'd up to the ceiling? There's just all these little elements to it. Rail is in a vulnerable spot where it's in this water. It's a teeny water spot, but if you go for rail, you can kind of get trapped there. There's just like, I think it's a brilliant map. I think it's an all-time great Quake map. I don't know where I would rank it exactly, but it's definitely my favorite QuakeLive duel map. And I even remember, rapha, I think initially he didn't really like it like a lot, but then he came around to it, and I think it's one of his favorite maps too now.
Come on. Has to be.
So, but yeah, like it was also one of those maps like no one disliked it, I'll say.
True.
At least, again, anecdotally.
Yeah.
Some people didn't like Aerowalk because, of the spawn frag situation. Some people didn't like DM13 Lost World because of it can be slower paced and just rocket only, but everyone loved Tourney 7, at least that's my recollection.
When you first played in the Quake 4 circuit in 2007, then when QuakeLive first came out in 2009, in this sort of an era, right, you weren't the top player. So one thing I wanted to ask you is, I always feel like this is another thing that people don't really discuss very much among pro players, is even for pros, I've always got the sense from talking to them, it's like being a casual at Quake, where, you know, the famous concept that it's actually what puts people off Quake, sadly. The idea that if I'm the noob and I begin, even if my friend's sort of a noob as well, if he's played for 2 months more than me, he's just going to tool me so hard in the game, I'm going to be like, actually, I'm not playing this. Let's play some other game. You know, what a joke is that would be like Fortnite or something, wouldn't it, right? But I don't think people realise, I've known a lot of pros where they tell me you have the same feeling sometimes when you're at the top of the pro scene. Like, when you're like the 6th best player, that might sound awesome to a fan. The problem is, in Quake, the best player just beats you every time still. It's the same feeling. It's like, fuck, he's on this level and I'm here. Did you ever have this sense in the early days of like, they're a step above me, or there's a distance I haven't broached yet, as it were?
Yeah, I don't think that really lasted super long, because I started taking maps from basically everybody. It was a matter of going from taking maps to taking sets, you know? So once you can take a map from somebody, you know you're close enough. The question is, the problem is if someone's 1 or 2% better over the course of 10-minute games and best of fives, that can stretch to be enough for them to reliably beat you. Maybe not every single match, but it really, that subtle difference, that tiny difference can be the game changer. But yeah, I would say at the beginning, someone like Toxic in Quake 4 just looked pretty untouchable. But then as I started improving personally, like I was taking maps off him, I was taking maps off basically everybody. And then once QuakeLive came out, you know, I was taking maps pretty much off everybody. So it was more of a consistency and some of the aspects of my game that I didn't perfect the way others did. But I never really felt for any kind of long period of time like these folks were just like on another planet.
One thing I would like to ask you is this obvious question, which is, since you had so many times in your career where you either upset the big dog but then didn't win yourself, or you were just in the final and you lost to the big favourite name or the big champion type players, right? This is one thing I want to ask you, which is, a lot of people have finally figured out there's like a mental game to esports too. And so the problem is, though, they make the narrative too simplistic, I think. Like, their logic goes, if you come second a lot, you must have just choked, or, you know, like you have nerve issues or something. And the problem I always think with that is, it can be true. There are certainly people who've had some of these issues. But I also think, but the problem, especially in a game like Quake, DaHanG, is it'd be one thing if we were playing some giant game like poker or something where millions of people play, and then the same person, you know, was in like 10 different tables against different players and lost. Yeah, that's probably that guy. He probably has he's the only defining factor. The problem I always think when you're trying to figure out if someone has these issues in a game like Quake is, you literally might only be losing to the same 3 people, and they might actually be, conversely, the most clutch players of all time. Like, it's kind of a hard thing to figure out. Like, I'm sure during your career you've thought about this before. So where do you come down on this? Like, is it something where, did you ever have issues in that sense? Do other people seem to have a natural strength in this regard? What's your take?
Yeah, so I mean, what's funny is not too long ago, I remember watching some of the 2012 final QuakeCon match I had against Cypher, because when I lost it, I basically knew there's no reason why he should have won. Right. And after watching it was map 4, I was up 2 maps to 1. On map 4, I had complete control. And I'm just watching myself miss so many easy rails, and they're not even like, not all of them were easy, but over the course, and that's been one of my weak areas sometimes, like just my aim in general. I can't just, you know, so I would just say, like, I think it's just an unfortunate outcome, basically, that happened in a lot of these cases. Thankfully, I did actually win a few major events as well, but like I personally don't think it's like, oh, I choked. Because what's actually funny is no one's really going to remember this except maybe Brian DKT Flander. But before that match, I was practicing against Sparks, and I beat Sparks pretty handily. But I look at my rail percentage; it's like 18%, and I'm like, okay, all right. If I don't change this, I lose, right? Sure. And then at the end of that Cypher game, map 4, you look at the scoreboard. I shot like a 16% rail, and I shot like 50-something shots. And if you watch, I completely outcontrolled the game. Like he was on the back foot. pretty much didn't have the options except hope I fail. He didn't really have a say in the matter. And then I see his real percentage, it's like 50%, and he hit like a few clutch rockets and exchanged rails versus me, but it's just one of those things. I just don't have that magic, like, just hit shots that everyone takes for granted. Right. Sometimes they just don't hit on my side, and that's always been the weakness. At least that's the way I see it. But yeah, the other point is, it's not like I got second versus like random folks that just popped up.
Yes.
Who else could even beat Cypher or Rapha like in their glory days, right? Pretty much nobody, right?
Well, the joke is even people like Cooler and Havoc went years without winning sometimes. Right. Yeah, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's like, is Karl Malone and John Stockton, are they chokers because they couldn't beat Michael Jordan? Or, it's sometimes you're literally just not the best, and that's just the way it is. Sometimes there are chokers, but, that's kind of my take on it.
Let me ask the other side of this question then. So the other thing is, not only because you played so many tournaments with all these players in the bracket, not only did you literally in official games beat all these people, but I'm going to guess in boot camps you've also played like a scrim against everyone and beaten everyone by the end. So the thing I would ask the other way around is this though: how do you handle it though if like you're in a scenario where, look, to the casual fan he will just go, well, of course Cypher beat you, Cypher is better, or Rapha was the GOAT or whatever. But like I said, you could beat these people. In fact, you have beat these people. How do you handle that part when like it's like it's possible, but it doesn't happen in the match that you want it to happen in? How do you handle it?
It's tough, especially since in Quake they're typically just one or two big events a year, and like that's it. So if you don't capitalize on those moments, like better luck next year, basically, or the next second event of the year, and it's hard to just get that deep anyway. So if you don't capitalize on it, then kind of shit out of luck. But it's just tough. There's really no way around it. Like, you invest the time and you kind of prepare correctly, and then it's one of those things. It's almost like, because you had a poker analogy. I'm sure you're familiar. It's almost like, okay, you went all in with ace king and they had queens. Who's gonna win? Flip a coin, basically, right? Like, that's the way I kind of see it, and it's just like, I feel like I just got unlucky, basically, in terms of me falling short. Like, I just didn't hit my rails, and I kind of attribute that to, okay, why did Steph Curry go 1 for 9 from 3, even though he shouldn't go 1 for 9 for 3? But it does happen, right? So it is what it is. So the only saving grace is that, looking back, I did win a few big ones. Like, I beat Rapha at the IEM North American Championship and QuakeLive, and then as we go into Quake Champions, I won basically the second biggest tournament ever in terms of prize money. So there are regrets, and it kind of sucks because there were just lost opportunities, but is what it is. But at least I don't have like the permanent, like, never did it ever stain on my legacy, right? So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I kind of fall back to at least I did it at least one time or two times, however you want to define it, because the Rapha one was a North American Championship, but it was on LAN, and it was a big deal. But so, there's compartmentalization and rationalization, right? But at the end of the day, kind of just is what it is.
One thing you bring up there that I always thought in Quake, especially because it's a 1v1 game in the duel circuit, and quite frankly, I know it's actually one of the few esports areas to hang where there never has been the sporting approach taken. Like, I can tell you in Counter-Strike, by the way, they don't only have like coaches, assistant coach, like they have like whole staffers, so it's like a fucking NFL team, mate. In fact, the joke in the modern days, even the general manager has a massive impact on the team. It's like sports, but we never really did that in Quake. Like in Quake, people didn't really have managers or coaches. They just had like the guy that booked the flights or whatever. So I've noticed it's always been on the player himself to sort of be his own coach in a sense. So one thing I would ask, you alluded to it there, is if you're not in a world like Counter-Strike where there's a tournament every month, it's more like there's 2 or 3 big ones. They're the ones that matter in history for legacy. And essentially it's a bit like in TI and Dota. It's like, you want to be good for that week. Fuck the rest of the year. Like, yeah, it's nice to be really good, the best all the time, but you've got to be good for these 2 or 3 tournaments, right? I noticed that became a massive skill as well. It's not just how good you are at the game. Like, the reason why Rapha might be the GOAT is he sounds like he's the best ever at that, like peaking for a tournament, like knowing when to start his practice, knowing if he's in North America, you know, do I do that thing where I just hold an open server? Do I get someone to come and boot camp with me for a week? Like, it seemed like from doing him when he was in SK with me, when I talked to him, that was the thing that always used to amaze me, was like how he could sort of like figure that out and know like when to start his prep, and in fact, when not to prep too much, like when to know, like, don't do it 3 months before, I'll be burned out a month and a half it. What would you say are the challenges in this sense? Because I feel like this is part of the hidden side of Quake people don't see. They think you're just as good as you are when you enter the server, but I'm sure there's a lot of, like, as you say, prep is essential, right?
Absolutely. I mean, it's like you have to just get into the mindset of like nothing matters for the next 2 weeks, 1 week, however long you're kind of really grinding it out, except this tournament coming up. So balancing sleep, diet, you know, practice, demo reviews, it's all going to fall on you as the individual. There's no coach, there's no manager. Even like we really never we never did like demo reviews of duels with each other.
Yeah.
You know, there's none of that. Like, it's all just by yourself. I mean, maybe on occasion, like randomly, not as like a true regimen, right? Thinking about like why Rapha had a lot of success, in addition to just the raw skill set, is people don't realize like he's basically the most like highly motivated competitor too, in my opinion, that like I've seen. Like, he wants it, like it's life or death, and that's a good thing, because if you're not, again, it's that 1 or 2% difference between you and the next guy sometimes. So if it's someone that just wants it that much more, like they might be focused more and make the right decision in the game, and maybe just that one subtle time where they're like a little apathetic, but he's like, no, I'm not giving in, like I'm never gonna give you with this angle or any, you know. Motivation is like probably the biggest factor that I don't think gets discussed enough. Like, it's, and the ironic part is because anecdotally speaking, for me, that 2017 Winter Dreamhack event that I won, I don't know what it was, but like I wanted it really bad,
right?
And like, because we were also competing in the sacrifice tournament, so like it was 2 tournaments at the same time, and like, you know, I think there might be a little bit of like luck. I happen to have won it the same time that I seem to have been the most motivated to win it, but there's something to it. If you're not all in, then you're not setting yourself up to have the championship at the end of the day, and that's something that I think Rapha is probably the GOAT in that respect. He just wants it more than anyone else, and there you go. You know.
Sure. No, actually, I do think that, like, since you touched on it, it's a very underrated quality, because I'll tell people this. Like, people will know Rapha also wasn't someone who was in, like, the old school of esports. In fact, he famously has that story where, like, I think because of his dad or something, like, he could only play when he went to his dad's house or something. So he actually had to be delayed for years and years and years to even compete in Quake at, like, the actual top level. And one thing I always thought was really cool about him is he always kept that, like, fans mentality, though. Like, to him, it always was really cool to play against, like, Cooler and beat him, or play Cypher and these top players. And actually, even though people might think this goes away and you get jaded, somehow he never did, mate. Like, I know towards the end he still had dreams, like, I want to be the one with the most QuakeCon titles, or I want to be like considered the best in this area. And it's like, the reason I can admire that so much is, on some level, you're not just letting the fact that this guy can beat you motivate you. You're like sort of competing against your own potential, which is kind of the dream, I think, to be an all-time great competitor in something, right? You got to kind of like push for your maximum, right?
Right. Like, he's not trying to match someone else's peak. He's trying to make his own peak be the peak of the entire esport.
Yes.
You know, and he's just so driven, so motivated, and he does everything right in terms of prep. So, and then you look at the resume, and it, you know, speaks for itself. So
I've got a tricky question for you. And it's one that I thought of it when I was doing an interview with, I think it was like Wenger or something like that, which is, I thought the other thing that people won't realize if they're a casual fan is the weirdest thing about being a top Quake dueler is by definition your rivals and competitors and your friends are the same people. It's a group of like 10 to 20 people. In fact, sometimes if you're at the top of it, might be 5 people. And the problem is, simultaneously, you're going to have to be friends with these people because you go on all the events. You're the only ones who like have the same overlap, who get life. But at the same time, you're also, while you're being friends with them, part of you's also trying to like probe them for info and see what they're thinking of what's going on in their games. And they're doing the same thing to you. So I've always thought the strange thing must be, in a way, you're like friends with Rapha, but you're also his main rival. You're also the NA rivals, and also you want to know, on the one hand, you want some info on how to play this guy he just beat, but then again, you know he's going to use info against you. It's kind of a bit tricky, right? It's kind of an interesting social dynamic.
It is, yeah. I mean, like, it's not a pool of 100+ players that can all beat each other. It's a pool of worldwide 15 to 20 that can potentially beat each other. I mean, there's still some gaps there, and then specifically in North America, I mean, it was, especially at the beginning of Quake Champions, it was just me and Rapha, to be frank. Later on, folks like Chain and some others really started improving, and some of the, South American players and so on, Zeniku, a lot of folks really started improving as Quake Champions progressed. But yeah, like, you kind of, it is a little awkward because, in game, we're merciless. We're trying to beat each other. We're not, trying to go easy on each other. And what's funny about between me and Rapha specifically, because obviously we couldn't really compete against the Europeans for practice. It's just not realistic unless we're boot camping. But whenever we played, and we didn't play a ton versus each other, but I felt like when we practiced versus each other, like we really tried. It almost felt like an elevated session,
right?
Especially because some of the times they'd be on stream, and people would get hyped for the the DaHanG versus Rapha streams and stuff, and I felt like those were actually really good preparation for like getting ready for the tournament, because I know he's not gonna experiment and play silly. He knows I'm not, and so
because you're really trying to win the game. You mean you're not like
absolutely.
Just playing it like a random scrim, right? I see, right?
Yeah, we're really going at it. And so just those small sessions, again, we'd only play each other maybe a couple times a month, maybe. But we were like kind of, at least my perspective is like we were kind of all in. I think he's all in on every practice
seems like
that he ever does. I'm probably not, but I was all in versus him. And those really, I feel like they really help a lot, because he's also, especially because I'm just thinking mainly of Quake Champions, he was so good at like every single champion, like I'll be honest, like there'd be maybe 2 or 3 that I just didn't feel like I could really play at the top level because either the movement style or the ability, whatever it may have been. He had no weakness. He'd play every champion, and so I would see more against him than another practice opponent as well. But yeah, there's no way around it. You gotta be friends with the guys you're competing against. You see them at all the events and such a small scene. So, but wouldn't trade it for anything.
Because the other thing I always thought made Quake a very cool game, it's not just the game engine and like the circuit and all that. It's also, I think, an underrated aspect is, much like a sport like something like tennis or something, because it's a 1v1 sport with like a limited pool of people who can win, each match isn't just like, oh, and here's someone from Sweden playing. So it's like, you guys have all played 1 million games against each other. So the brilliant thing is, especially actually if you're a fan who's also watched all these games and you know what like the references are, you can see in a game that might look like a boring stalemate, like this is actually the most tense game of all time. Like this guy knows if he lets him get this item, he's really good in control. He's trying to stop him from going to the rail or what. Like if you actually know like what the reference is, I always feel like that people don't necessarily know how deep the mind games go. Like when you actually know the top players, you've got years of reference stuff you're going back on, right?
Absolutely. Like, this is what's interesting too, because again, like I've just been so exposed to Rapha as a competitor and a teammate over the years. I feel like I know his style so well, so like he doesn't do things that surprise me, interestingly, and like the ratio of success I've had versus him is actually more lopsided than it should be. Like
right.
I probably have beaten him 35 to 40% of all maps, official maps.
Oh, right.
I don't know about matches. It's probably still in that arena, when on paper I probably should have only won like 20%. Right. But because like basically he doesn't do stupid things, whereas the other players, whenever they do something stupid, it can pay off huge versus me because I'm not expecting it.
Right.
And I know that sounds like
no, I know what you mean. It's more predictable if he does like the correct play, sort of, right?
Yeah, I'm expecting the correct play, but when someone's like out in La La Land and then they hit 3 straight rails on me, that could do me in. He's not going to be out on the side of the map going for 3 stupid rails, and so there are definitely things about individual competitors that you need to watch out for, and you shouldn't. I'm thinking back to like even like someone like Toxic. All you want to do versus him, at least the way I thought about it, back in the Quake Champions era, because of the DreamHack Winter event, was like I just want to like control the map and like basically let him take dumb fights if possible,
right?
And don't like encourage a 50-50 LG fight or something versus him. Like basically play kind of boring and lame, to be frank, but control the map and let him make mistakes. But I can't just say that versus Rapha. Like play boring, control the map, and let him make mistakes. That doesn't work versus Rapha. Rafa's going to be the one that's constantly doing chip damage and pressuring you smartly and like putting you on the back foot. So it's I wish people understood more the nuances between each individual personality and what their strengths and weaknesses are, because when you're playing it, it's so clear what people's tendencies are, and it's a very unique competitive landscape for sure.
Right, being as in theory you're retired, you can tell us a little bit of the secret sauce. Who's like the most tricky person for you in that sense? Who's the one where their style, something about it always catches you off, or it's harder to read or something?
I mean, in the QuakeLive days, it was Cypher, because he didn't even. There were times where he would like not try to control the map too well, and just bank on hitting shot after shot after shot while dodging damage as well. And that, again, like there's really no one in North America I could practice against that could do that in any reputable way. Like I would just kind of steamroll everyone that's not named Rapha if they try to do that, because like, okay, I'm coming after you, I have an extra 150 total health and armor, and you're at this disadvantaged point of the map. Even if you hit me with big rockets, I'll finish you off with maybe 70 health and pick up the item afterwards, so I'm kind of recovered. But with him, he'd be in these spots that often didn't really make sense, because what I think happens too is a lot of that European style with like Cypher and like Cooler, they gave each other a lot more breathing room than I think is warranted. So they would just play a lot more slow and methodical, which to me is actually not the optimized way to play. And like as we went into Quake Champions, I think Rapha put that whole thing to bed. And then, but even folks like Razy put it to bed. You can't play slow and methodical in Quake Champions, and I think you really shouldn't in QuakeLive either, even though you can, because it's a slower game and there are some really hard choke points on these maps. But I mean, at the end of the day, it must have been Cypher, because his rocket aim, his positioning was so strong. He didn't need health and armor. He could still pull it off. So, yeah, he's probably the one.
By the way, was it the case that when you had this period where you played Overwatch, people don't know, you and Rapha and a bunch of other Quake players were all playing Overwatch. There was even some CS people in there, right? Obviously, at the time, I remember the esports industry at the time, no one actually knew at the time that Overwatch League would end up having so many non-endemic companies, like all these giant like sports teams and stuff. But people thought it would be more like LCS and League of Legends, where it's like all the endemic teams. And since you were on Team Liquid, they were obviously like one of the most eligible people to get signed. Like, you think about it, if you're on someone like Team Cloud9, these are basically the ultimate orgs to be on. They're always going to be in every league. So the perception actually at the time was Team Liquid's probably going to be in the Overwatch League. So when this didn't happen, now look, it turns out, happenstance-wise, this was when Quake Champions came out, so the perfect out for you. You and Raph can just go back to that game. What I always wondered was this: if there was a world where, for whatever reason, Team Liquid had become an Overwatch League team, and Overwatch had been a big thing potentially for the org you're already on, do you think you would have just kept playing and you would have been an Overwatch Pro instead?
I probably would have, if Quake Champions didn't come out at the time, and if that opportunity presented itself. It would have been a big like life change. I'd pretty much have to put my career on hold for a year or two, whatever it may be, and literally go and pursue the Overwatch League, which is like a full-time, you have to move situation. But yeah, and I remember, having talks with Internet Hulk, who unfortunately passed away, and much of the other folks who were like trying to get me to go into the Overwatch League, and like I think that was a very realistic prospect at the time. And Team Liquid was interested in it. I don't know the details, but I just think the price tag was just too high for them to justify it. So they were like, you know what, we're not going to do this. But yeah, like you said, like Quake Champions came out, and it was almost like I could just dive right into this game with this gigantic QuakeCon tournament 2017. They say there are going to be more events like that, and it's, you know, my first love, Quake, so it was pretty much an easy choice at that point to just go, like, I don't have to put my life on hold. I can still compete and win a lot of prize money, hopefully, and, you know, give it one last hurrah before I really retire, so...
Because the thing I would ask you is this. I often wondered, that's why I asked earlier if you're just kind of like a Quake purist on it, like how you could have this time where you went to other games. Because even though I'm sure on the esports side it would be cool in a way, like would the game have been able to sustain you? Like could like look, it was a huge league to be fair, with like millions of dollars and mega, like there was all Korean stuff. So I'm sure there'd be some aspect that'd be stimulating. Do you never worry like what would have happened if you didn't have like Quake at its core? Like would you never have gotten bored of the game? Could you have just played for competition, you think?
I'm not sure I understand. Played Quake only for competition?
As in, no, Overwatch. I mean, if you'd have had to become an Overwatch pro, and it was like, let's say it was like the whole Overwatch League, but like 3 or 4 years long. You think you could have just had a whole pro career? Would you not have gotten bored or something?
The problem was I was like basically, 30 at that time. It is starting to get at the end. I think in my mind, if I was going to do Overwatch League, it was just going to be for like 1 year, maybe 2. This was not going to be... It's a real grind, you know, like... You have to live and breathe the game, and as soon as that passion starts dying down a little bit, I think it's kind of time to pack it in. So I don't think I would have gone 3 or 4 years. I don't even know necessarily. I mean, taking that for granted, I don't even know that I could be skilled enough by year 3 or year 4 to be a true starting player and a true asset to a team. I think I was already kind of in that borderline area. Like, can I be in the league? Can I not? I think I could have been. Would I have been a shining star? Probably not, but who knows? But I think I was already kind of like, I was almost like glad I didn't have to keep doing it because Quake Champions came out. I was almost like, you know what, this has run its course, and it was because with Quake Champions you only need to play 12, 15 hours a week, like honestly, and then with Overwatch it's like a full-time job, whether it's reviewing demos and practicing and all that. So I don't think I would have pursued it beyond maybe like the very first year of Overwatch League.
In this esports world, it can seem like everyone's against you, but I've always got the Illuminati, my Patreon community, riding with me. And it is thanks to the support of the following people, this video and all of them on my channel are made possible. Matt, Pugnacho Rakula, Ahmed Haju, Frisky, Tosh, Jensen Go, Animosity, Toucan, Tobias Bernasconi. If you've ever watched my videos, you know now I'm going to give a massive shout out to Jerky's Minion, the main man. Do you want to suggest a topic or a guest for my content? You want teasers? Find out who the upcoming interview guests are. Maybe you want to ask me a question. I tend to answer them at length in my video AMA. Do you want to take part in one of those dinner discussions where we talk about what you're interested in esports? Well, if any of these perks or more appeal to you, put your money where your mouth is. Join the Illuminati today, where in the description box below is a Patreon link.